In the deep, suffocating triple-canopy rainforests of Phuoc Tuy province, silence was usually a predator. Silence meant the enemy was waiting, watching, and preparing to strike. But for a 5-man SAS patrol pinned down in a ravine near the long high hills, silence was no longer an option. The time for stealth had passed hours ago. Now, their world was a cacophony of cracking AK-47 fire, the terrifying thump of enemy mortars walking closer, and the ragged breathing of men who knew they were about to die. The situation was a textbook nightmare. The patrol had bumped into a reinforced North Vietnamese Army, NVA company, outnumbered 20-1. They had fought a fighting withdrawal for 3 kilometers, burning through their ammunition and exhausting their water. Now, with their backs against a sheer limestone cliff and the enemy maneuvering to flank them, the mathematics of survival had reached zero. They had popped their last smoke grenade, a plume of violet gas struggling to rise through the thick canopy. But looking up, the patrol leader saw only a solid roof of green. The trees here were ancient giants, towering 150 feet into the air, their branches interlocking to form an impenetrable barrier. There was no clearing, there was no landing zone, LZ. By every rule of military aviation, they were unreachable. Then, they felt it before they heard it. It started as a vibration in the sternum, a rhythmic pulse that seemed to sync with their frantic heartbeats. Then came the sound, the distinctive, heavy whop-whop-whop of rotor blades slapping the humid air. It was the Bell UH-1 Iroquois, the Huey. To a civilian, it was just a noise. To a soldier in Vietnam, it was the sound of life itself. It was the cavalry, the ambulance, and the ticket home all wrapped in aluminum and rivets. But hope quickly turned to dread. The radio operator, screaming over the noise of the firefight, relayed the situation to the inbound birds. No LZ. Repeat, no LZ. Canopy is solid. Standard operating procedure for US Army Aviation or Royal Australian Air Force, RAAF doctrine, was clear. If there is no hole in the trees, you cannot land, you cannot winch. You abort and call for airstrikes, hoping the ground team can hold out until a clearing can be blown open with high explosives. But the SAS patrol didn't have hours, they had minutes. High above the canopy, the flight lead of the RAAF helicopters looked down. He saw the purple smoke filtering through the leaves. He saw the flashes of enemy gunfire closing in on the 5 desperate Australians. He looked at his fuel gauge, then at his co-pilot. These were not ordinary pilots. They were the men of No. 9 Squadron RAAF. They didn't fly by the manual. They flew by a code of brotherhood that bordered on insanity. They called themselves the Bushrangers, named after the wild, outlaw bandits of Australian history. The voice that crackled back over the SAS radio wasn't panicked. It didn't cite safety regulations. It was calm, flat, and distinctly Australian. Albatross 10 has a visual on your smoke. Keep your heads down, boys. We're coming into the living room. The SAS patrol leader looked up in disbelief. Coming in? How? There was no way through the trees. Unless, of course, the pilots intended to make one. To understand the sheer insanity of the rescue that was about to unfold, you have to understand who was sitting in the cockpit. Officially, they were the Royal Australian Air Force No. 9 Squadron. Their radio call sign was Albatross, a majestic, if somewhat lumbering, seabird. But in the irreverent slang of the Australian military, they earned a different name, one that stuck to them like the red dust of Nui Dat, the Bushrangers. In Australian folklore, Bushrangers were 19th-century outlaws, men like Ned Kelly who roamed the wild frontier, defying authority and living by their own code. For the pilots of No. 9 Squadron, the name was a badge of honour. It signified that when the chips were down, the rulebook was the first thing to be thrown out the window. They were a tiny unit in a massive war. The American 1st Cavalry Division nearby had hundreds of helicopters. They swarmed the sky like angry wasps. If a US Army pilot crashed a Huey, there was a replacement waiting on the tarmac before the wreckage stopped smoking. The Americans treated helicopters like ammunition, expendable assets to be used up in the pursuit of victory. The Australians didn't have that luxury. No. 9. Squadron possessed a grand total of 16 UH-1 Iroquois helicopters for the entire war. 16. That was it. Every single airframe was a precious national asset. Losing one wasn't just a bad day, it was a strategic disaster for the entire task force. Logic dictates that when you have a scarce resource, you protect it. You don't fly it into box canyons. You don't hover it motionless over enemy machine guns. You definitely don't use its delicate aluminum rotor blades to chop down hardwood trees. But the Bushrangers operated on a different logic. To them, the 16 helicopters were not museum pieces. They were tools, and the 5 men on the ground were family. There was a grim understanding between the RAAF pilots and the SAS troopers. They drank at the same mess halls, played cricket on the same dust patches, and shared the same cynicism about the brass. For the SAS, this relationship was existential. They had worked with American pilots, and while many were brave, there was always a lingering fear of the rules of engagement. The SAS knew that if the flak got too heavy, a US pilot might receive orders to abort the extraction to save the aircraft. It was a cold, calculated military decision. With the Bushrangers, that calculation didn't exist. An SAS patrol leader knew that if he called for a Bushranger, the pilot would fly that chopper until the rotors fell off or the engine exploded. They would fly through monsoon storms that grounded the birds, and they would descend into fire that withered the leaves off the trees. So, as the sound of the rotors grew louder over the trapped patrol, the men on the ground didn't just feel relief. They felt a fierce, tribal pride. They looked up through the breaks in the canopy and saw the distinctive red kangaroo roundel painted on the side of the fuselage. It wasn't the clinically efficient US Army coming to get them. It was the mad taxi drivers of No. 9 Squadron. The Bushrangers were here, and they were about to prove that 16 helicopters were enough if you flew them like you stole them. The radio crackled again. "Albatross, this is ground. No winch. Too hot. Repeat, too hot for winch." The patrol leader was right. To winch 5 men out of triple-canopy jungle required the helicopter to hover stationary at 100 feet above the trees for nearly 10 minutes. In a live firefight, a stationary helicopter is not a rescue vehicle. It is a target practice piñata. The NVA gunners below would shred the thin aluminum belly of the Huey before the first man was halfway up the wire. The pilot of the lead slick, a flight lieutenant with a sweat-stained flight suit and eyes hidden behind aviator shades, made a decision that would have given a safety officer a heart attack. If he couldn't pull the men up through the trees, he would bring the helicopter down to the trees. "Hold on, boys," the pilot muttered over the intercom to his crew. "We're going to do a little gardening." He dropped the collective pitch lever. The Huey stopped hovering and began to sink like a stone towards the green roof of the jungle. This was the legendary, forbidden art of lawn mowing. The UH-1 second main rotor blades are massive, hollow spars of metal spinning at hundreds of revolutions per minute. They are designed to slice through air, not oak and teak. But the Bushrangers had discovered a desperate loophole in aerodynamics. If you hit the soft upper branches of the canopy hard enough, the vegetation yields before the metal does. The sound changed instantly. The rhythmic whop-whop of the air was replaced by a violent, terrifying whackcrackszhred. It sounded like a giant was feeding a piano into a wood chipper. Inside the cockpit, the vibration was bone-shaking. The instrument panel blurred. The torque gauge spiked dangerously into the red as the engine screamed to maintain rotation against the resistance of the foliage. Down below, the SAS patrol watched in awe mixed with terror. The sky above them literally fell apart. Massive branches, leaves, and pulverized wood rained down on their heads. Through the shower of debris, the dark green belly of the Huey emerged, forcing its way down like an angry dragon. The pilot was wrestling the cyclic stick, fighting the violent bucking of the machine as the blades hacked a vertical shaft through the forest roof. The helicopter didn't land, it couldn't. The skids were still 6 feet off the uneven ground, hovering amidst the shattered stumps of the trees it had just decapitated. The nose of the aircraft was virtually touching a tree trunk. The tail rotor was inches from a cliff face. "Get in! Get in!" the door gunner screamed, his M60 machine gun blazing away into the surrounding bush to keep the enemy heads down. The SAS troopers scrambled. They didn't climb. They threw themselves onto the floor of the cabin, diving over the skids, breathless and covered in sweat and sawdust. The moment the last boot was inside, the pilot pulled maximum power. The engine groaned, the warning lights flickered, and the battered bird clawed its way back up through the hole it had just dug, rising into the safety of the sky. Back at the Nui Dat airbase, the adrenaline faded, replaced by the grim reality of maintenance. The crew chief walked around the aircraft, inspecting the damage. The leading edges of the rotor blades looked like serrated steak knives. They were gouged, dented, and green with chlorophyll. An engineering officer ran out, his face turning purple as he looked at the ruined blades equipment worth thousands of dollars, destroyed in 5 minutes. "What the hell did you do to my aircraft?" he screamed at the pilot. "You used a helicopter as a machete." The pilot just lit a cigarette, his hand still shaking slightly from the adrenaline. He looked at the engineer, then at the 5 SAS troopers walking away across the tarmac, alive and safe. "Sorry, mate," the pilot grinned. "Just doing a bit of landscaping. Put it on my tab." The flight manual for the Bell UH-1 Iroquois is a thick, humorless document written by engineers and safety officers in comfortable offices. It is filled with bold warnings, red text, and diagrams illustrating the dead man's curve. It explicitly forbids maneuvers that stress the airframe beyond its design limits. It advises against flying into confined areas with limited egress. It strictly prohibits flying backward at speed in close proximity to terrain. To the pilots of No. 9 Squadron. This manual served a very specific purpose. It made an excellent doorstop for the officers' mess. In the chaotic topography of Vietnam, the enemy didn't play by the rules of aerodynamics. The NVA often ambushed SAS patrols in box canyons, steep, 3-sided ravines that acted as natural traps. For a helicopter pilot, a box canyon is a coffin. If you fly in nose first to pick up the team, you have to come to a hover, turn 180 degrees to face the exit, and then accelerate out. In a narrow ravine, there is no room to turn. You are trapped, hovering motionless, presenting your tail rotor to the rock walls and your cockpit to the enemy guns. So, the Bushrangers invented a maneuver that defied both the manual and common sense: backing in. It is a terrifying sensation to fly a helicopter backward into a hole. The pilot is effectively blind. He cannot see the landing zone behind him. He cannot see the jagged limestone cliffs slicing past the tail boom. He cannot see the trees reaching out to snag the skids. He surrenders total control of the aircraft's positioning to the voice in his headset, the crewman in the back. Albatross. 2. Coming back. Steady, the crewman's voice would drone, calm and monotonous, while hanging halfway out of the open door, suspended only by a monkey harness. He was the pilot's eyes. He watched the tail rotor, the helicopter's Achilles heel, spinning inches away from the granite walls. Back 10, left 2. Watch the tail, watch the tail. Back 5. The pilot would gently manipulate the cyclic and pedals, reversing 5 tons of vibrating metal into a space barely wide enough for a family car. It was like reversing a bus down a winding alleyway at 40 miles an hour while people shot at you from the rooftops. The margin for error was measured in centimeters. If the tail rotor clipped a branch or the canyon wall, the delicate gearbox would shatter. The helicopter would spin violently out of control, smashing into the canyon floor and killing everyone on board. Yet, they did it, again and again. On the ground, the SAS troopers would watch in disbelief. They would see the Huey appear at the mouth of the canyon, not flying forward, but flying backward, tail first, dipping and weaving through the obstacles. It looked like a film reel being played in reverse. The logic behind the madness was sound. By backing in, the helicopter was already facing the exit. The moment the troops scrambled on board, sometimes diving onto the floor, as the skids hovered momentarily on a rock ledge, the pilot didn't need to turn. He simply shoved the cyclic forward and dropped the nose. The Huey would scream out of the canyon like a drag racer, trading the dangerous hover for airspeed and safety in seconds. Back at Nui Dat, the safety officers would look at the flight logs and shake their heads. They would point out that the torque limits had been exceeded, that the transmission had been overstressed, and that the maneuver was technically prohibited. The Bushrangers didn't care. They knew that in the jungle, safety was a relative term. A stressed transmission could be replaced, a cracked tail boom could be fixed, but a 5-man patrol overrun by the NVA? That was permanent. The manual was written to save the machine. The Bushrangers flew to save the men. The Bell UA-1 Iroquois is not a tank. It is not an armoured personnel carrier. In the cold light of engineering reality, it is a fragile collection of rivets, plexiglass, and aluminum sheeting so thin you could almost puncture it with a screwdriver. The pilots joked that the skin of the aircraft was made of recycled beer cans. It offered zero ballistic protection. A standard AK-47 round could punch through one side of the fuselage, pass through the cabin, and exit the other side without even slowing down. And yet, in the heat of battle, the Bushrangers turned this fragile eggshell into a shield. The scenario was always the same, a hot extraction. The SAS patrol had broken cover and was sprinting across a clearing toward the waiting bird. The enemy was right behind them, firing from the tree line. In a standard pickup, the helicopter lands parallel to the threat to give the door gunner a clear field of fire. But this leaves the loading troops exposed. As they scramble for the door, they are open targets for every enemy rifleman in the bushes. The pilots of No. 9 Squadron developed a maneuver that was suicidal in its generosity. As the troops broke into the open, the pilot would stomp on the pedal and haul the cyclic over, yawing the helicopter around. He would deliberately position the aircraft between the enemy fire and the running Australians. He was turning the helicopter into a physical wall. To appreciate the courage this required, you have to sit in the pilot's seat. The pilot is sitting in a glass bubble. His feet are resting on pedals behind a thin sheet of transparent plexiglass, the chin bubble. He is looking directly at the muzzle flashes in the tree line. He is offering himself, his crew, and his machine as a sponge for enemy lead, so that 5 muddy, exhausted infantrymen can have a few seconds of cover to climb aboard. The sound inside the cockpit during these moments was sickening. It wasn't the roar of the engine that dominated. It was the ping, whack, thud of bullets striking the airframe. Survivors describe it as sounding like someone throwing a handful of gravel against a tin roof. Every impact was a potential catastrophe. A bullet to the engine meant a fiery crash. A bullet to the hydraulic lines meant a total loss of control. A bullet through the windshield meant a dead pilot. Yet, the bushranger at the controls would sit there, immobile as a statue. His hands made micro-adjustments to the cyclic to keep the bird steady in the hover. He didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He held his ground while the aircraft shuddered under the impacts. Outside, the SAS troopers would dive behind the tail boom or under the belly of the Huey, using the fuselage as cover. They could hear the rounds slamming into the metal inches above their heads. They knew exactly what was happening. They knew that the man in the front seat was taking the hits for them. "Load 'em up! Go! Go!" the crewman would scream, hauling the troopers in by their webbing. Only when the crewman slapped the bulkhead and yelled, "Clear!" would the pilot unleash the power. He would drop the nose and bank sharply away from the fire, the helicopter groaning under the strain. Back at altitude, the adrenaline would crash. The pilot would look down at his instrument panel, often finding the glass shattered or a bullet hole through the floor mat between his legs. They called it the aluminum shield. It was a shield made of nothing but thin metal and sheer willpower, but to the men running across that field, it was the strongest wall in the world. In the tactical playbook of No. 9 Squadron, the rescue helicopter never flew alone. It was always part of a binary star system, a pair of aircraft dancing a lethal waltz above the battlefield. The first aircraft was the Slick, the transport mule stripped of heavy weaponry to maximize lift for carrying troops. The Slick was the shield, but hovering right above it, casting a long, dark shadow, was the Sword, the bushranger gunship. If the Slick was an ambulance, the gunship was a flying tank. The RAAF had modified these UA-1 into Predators. They bolted on heavy external racks carrying M158 7-tube rocket launchers and, most terrifying of all, the M134 minigun systems. The minigun was an electrically driven rotary cannon capable of spewing 4,000 rounds of 7.62 mm ammunition per minute. The coordination between the two was a masterpiece of violence. As the Slick dropped its nose to begin the precarious lawnmowing descent into the jungle, the gunship would enter a tight, predatory orbit directly overhead. It flew in a banked turn, nose pointed inward, effectively creating a cone of death around the rescue zone. For the SAS troopers huddled on the ground, the sound of the gunship was distinct from anything else in the war. A standard machine gun goes bang, bang, bang. A minigun does not. It spins so fast that the individual shots merge into a single, terrifying noise, a low, electric groan, often described as the sound of God unzipping the sky or a giant piece of canvas being ripped apart. Brrrr. When the slick touched down, the enemy would often try to rush the landing zone, sensing the vulnerability of the stationary target. This was the gunship's moment. The pilot would roll in, unleashing a torrent of tracers that looked like a solid red laser beam connecting the aircraft to the ground. The jungle floor would simply disintegrate. Trees were sawed in half. Earth was churned into mist. One of the most surreal experiences for the SAS troopers and the slick crew during a hot extraction was the rain of brass. Because the gunship was orbiting directly above the slick to provide the closest possible support, the spent shell casings from its miniguns were ejected downwards. Thousands of hot brass cartridges would rain down from the sky. Inside the slick, the crew chief would hear a metallic tinkle, tinkle, tinkle on the roof of the fuselage, sounding like a sudden hailstorm. It was the debris of their guardian angel. To a pilot in any other situation, hearing metal hitting the roof is a cause for panic, but to a slick pilot in a hot LZ, the sound of falling brass was the most comforting noise in the world. It meant the big brother upstairs was firing, and if he was firing, nothing on the ground could survive to shoot back. This death pair tactic changed the psychology of the extraction. The slick pilot could focus entirely on the impossible task of hovering amidst the trees, ignoring the enemy fire, because he trusted the gunship implicitly. He knew that the gunship pilot would place his rockets within 10 meters of the rotor blades if necessary. The gunship created a sanctuary of violence. Inside the circle of the orbit, the noise was deafening and the destruction absolute. But for the men climbing onto the slick, it was the safest place in Vietnam. They were standing in the eye of a hurricane manufactured by No. 9 Squadron. The war didn't end when the skids touched the tarmac at the Nui Dat base. For the men of the SAS and No. 9 Squadron, the mission only truly concluded in the Boozer, the makeshift mess halls built from ammunition crates and sandbags. It was here, amidst the smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke, that the true nature of their relationship was revealed. There was an ironclad, unwritten rule in the task force. You save my life, I buy your drinks. On nights following a hot extraction, the pilots of the Bushrangers would never have to reach for their wallets. Dirty, exhausted SAS troopers, still wearing their jungle greens stained with red earth and cordite, would line the bar. They would slap a cold stubby of Victoria Bitter into the hand of a pilot who, hours earlier, had been hovering 5 feet above them while taking machine gun fire. This ritual was more than just camaraderie. It was a payment of a debt that could never really be settled. The SAS were the elite of the elite hardmen who feared nothing in the jungle, but they were humble in the presence of the pilots. They knew that without the busies, their elite skills meant nothing. They would have been dead in that ravine. This bond created a fierce, almost irrational loyalty. The Australian task force had access to American air support. The US Army's aviation capabilities were massive. They could put 50 helicopters in the sky at a moment's notice. But given the choice, an SAS patrol leader would often make a decision that baffled outsiders. If a patrol was in trouble, and American slicks were 10 minutes away, but the Bushrangers were 30 minutes away, the SAS would often radio back, "Well, wait for the Bushrangers." It was a decision that risked death, but it was calculated. The SAS knew the American rules of engagement. US pilots were brave, incredibly so, but they operated under a massive bureaucracy. If an LZ was deemed too hot, if the volume of fire risked the loss of the airframe, a US flight commander might order the extraction aborted. It wasn't cowardice. It was math. You don't trade $1 million aircraft and a crew of 4 for a team of 5. The Bushrangers didn't do math. They didn't have an abort threshold. The SAS knew that if a No. 9 Squadron pilot said, "I'm coming to get you," he was coming. It didn't matter if the sky was falling. It didn't matter if the helicopter was leaking hydraulic fluid. It didn't matter if the pilot had to fly backward into a cave or chop down a tree with his rotors. They would not leave an Australian soldier on the ground. This certainty was the psychological anchor for the SAS. It allowed them to operate with the terrifying aggression they were famous for. They could push deep into enemy territory, initiate combat against superior numbers, and take insane risks because they carried a guarantee in their back pocket. They knew that the mad taxi drivers would come. In the mess hall, as the night wore on and the stories flowed, the lines between the units blurred. The pilots would show off the bullet holes in their flight helmets. The SAS would show the shrapnel scars on their arms. They were two different breeds. One lived in the sky, the other in the dirt, but in those moments they were the same. They were men who had looked into the abyss of a hot LZ and found that the only thing stronger than the fear of death was the fear of letting your mates down. The sun usually set quickly over Nui Dat, turning the red dust of the base into a deep, bloody crimson. It was at this hour that the flights would return. To a casual observer, a landing helicopter looks graceful, but when the Bushrangers returned from a hot extraction, there was nothing graceful about it. The aircraft didn't glide, they limped. The sound of the rotors was often uneven, a wop-wop-whir-wop, betraying the aerodynamic imbalance caused by jagged metal edges. As the skids crunched onto the tarmac and the turbines whined down, the true cost of the mission became visible. These machines were not the pristine, glossy aircraft seen in recruitment posters. They looked like they had been chewed up and spat out by the jungle itself. The most iconic scar was the green stain. The leading edges of the main rotor blades were often stripped of paint and hammered into jagged saws, deeply stained with the chlorophyll of the trees they had hacked through. It was the visual signature of the lawnmower tactic, proof that the pilot had literally fought the forest to get to his men. Then there was the fuselage. Some helicopters returned, looking like flying sieves. Mechanics would walk around the aircraft with grease pencils, circling the bullet holes to count the damage. It was not uncommon to find 20, 30, or 40 holes in a single airframe. They dotted the tail boom, shattered the plexiglass of the chin bubbles, and punched through the floorboards where the SAS troopers had been lying minutes before. There were stories of aircraft returning with tree branches still jammed into the landing skids, or with severed vines wrapped around the tail rotor shaft, souvenirs of a flight path that had violated every law of aviation safety. Yet, despite the catastrophic damage, the machines had held together long enough to get home. The legacy of Nober 9 Squadron is not found in the number of enemies killed, but in the number of friends saved. In the chaotic, morally ambiguous, and often terrifying landscape of the Vietnam War, the Bushrangers provided the one thing every soldier craves but rarely finds: absolute certainty. For the SAS trooper deep in the bush, the war was a swirl of variables. The intelligence might be wrong. The enemy might be stronger than expected. The radio might fail. But the Bushrangers were a constant. They were the immovable object in a fluid war. The image of those battered Hueys leaking fluid, vibrating with damage, yet still flying, became a sacred symbol. It represented a contract signed not with ink, but with risk. It said, "We will wreck this machine to save you. We will strip the gears, burn the engine, and shred the rotors. The aircraft is replaceable. You are not." History remembers the SAS as the phantoms of the jungle, the silent killers who moved like ghosts. But the phantoms knew the truth. They knew that when the silence was broken and the world turned into fire, they were only alive because of a group of pilots who were crazy enough to fly buses into a gunfight. They were the Bushrangers, the outlaws who broke every rule in the book just to make sure their brothers came home for a beer.